Hey, I'm John Spong. I'm a staff writer at Texas Monthly Magazine, and I've been invited to participate in this Bedtime Stories series, uh, which seems like a great way to give people something else to think about right now. And so I've been asked to read a story that I wrote in 2015 about my dad. It's called The Will of God. When it ran in the magazine, it looked like this, and it reads like this. Early one Wednesday evening in February 1988, a sophomore at Austin's Westlake High School named Mike Smith called his mom and asked for a ride home. He was 16, blue-eyed and blonde-headed, tall and slightly built, quiet but known by the kids as a nice guy, a good student, in the middle of the pack finisher for the school's JV cross-country team. It was shortly after 5 o'clock. Track practice had just ended, and he couldn't find the friend who normally gave him a lift home. His mom, Sherry Taylor, was an office manager for a plastic surgeon, and she wasn't quite finished at work. The previous couple weeks had been rough. She'd left her alcoholic second husband, Mike's stepdad. She'd moved with Mike into a rented duplex, and she'd filed for divorce. Now she was behind at the office. "Sure, Mike," she said, "but I've got a little bit left here. I'll be there in 30 minutes. She was wrapping up one last bit of paperwork, filling out a bank slip to speed up a morning deposit, when the phone rang again. "I found my ride, Mom," said Mike. "Great," she said. "You two wait for me at the house, and then I'll take you to dinner when I get home." 3 minutes later, she was out the door. On the drive, she heard a traffic reporter on the radio announce a single-car collision on Pinnacle Road that had resulted in one fatality. Pinnacle was the shortest route from the high school to her new place. Depending on where the wreck had occurred, she and Mike would likely both pass the scene, just as she had guessed, when she drove by Pinnacle, she saw a crowd gathered around several police cars and an ambulance. But then she got home, and she found an empty driveway, and suddenly she was scared. She hurried to the accident and recognized the car folded around the streetlight. She ran to a police officer and told him that her son had been riding in it, but in the commotion, the police officer misheard her. "Don't worry," he said. "The driver just broke his arm. He's been taken to the hospital already." That meant that the fatality she'd heard about on the radio was Mike. All her life, Sherry had imagined that losing a child must be the worst pain a person could know. And now she was living it. She collapsed unconscious in the street. The despair was overwhelming, all day and every day. Mike was her only child. Her husband was gone. Her mother and her first husband, Mike's father, were both deceased, and she was estranged from her own father. Sympathy from friends brought no comfort. When her best friend said, "If it was my daughter, I don't think I could make it, but you're so strong and you'll pull through," Sherry could only wonder why it wasn't okay for her to fall apart, because that's what she felt herself doing. She was completely alone. 2 weeks after the accident, a neighbor told her to call Will Spong. Will was an Episcopal priest, a seminary professor, and a grief counselor. When she reached him, he skipped past the small talk. "Here's what I need you to do," he said. "I need you to get Mike's suitcase, take it to his room, and fill it with everything that mattered to him. His books, his records, toys he played with when he was little. Get a scrapbook with pictures of him. And then I need you to bring those things to my office. I'm free all this Sunday, and if you can come then, I'll set the day aside for us. We'll look at his picture, we'll read his books, we'll listen to his music. But before we can do anything, I've got to know who Mike was." So she was there that Sunday. And whatever she might have expected a priest to look like, Will wasn't it. He met her in street clothes, a big man, 6'4", with a healthy middle girth and long, thin arms. He had dusky blue eyes, a thick brown beard, hair over his collar, and a subtle North Carolina lilt to his low voice. His office was softly lit and decorated with 70s hand-me-downs, overstuffed furniture covered in worn leather and corduroy. One long wall was lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves cluttered with books, records, and, oddly, dozens of plush toys and figurines of frogs and circus clowns, some peeking around a banner hanging from the top shelf that displayed a lyric from the musical Zorba. "Life is what you do while you're waiting to die." Sherry showed Will her son's sophomore class picture. They spread Mike's leather jacket out on the coffee table and sorted through his old Legos and Star Wars figures. They passed a guitar back and forth that he had just begun learning to play, and they put on Walk of Life by Dire Straits on repeat on the stereo, and they cried a lot. Sherry started seeing Will at least once a week, and the discussions never got easy. She wrestled endlessly with if onlys and whys. She was mad at herself, at her ex-husband, at the driver, and most painfully at God. She'd been raised a good Methodist. When she was little, she'd read prayer books every night before bed, lest something bad happen the next day. And now God had either taken Mike from her or done nothing to save him. How could God kill a good kid? She asked during one session. Why are there bad kids still living when Mike is dead? God made a choice. Will replied, You think the bad kids should die and the good kids should live? God didn't keep his own son from getting killed. Don't push me, she snapped back. I'm alone, forever, and I don't want to go on living. But if I kill myself, God won't let me into heaven, and then I won't see Mikey again. Well, Will said, it looks like you'll have to live then. But you're afraid of living, and you're afraid of dying. So what's next? Don't tell me it's going to get better. Don't tell me Mike would have gone to college in 2 years and I would have lost him anyway. Don't tell me his death served some purpose. I wouldn't tell you that, Will said. I don't think his death served any purpose. You're not helping me, she said. You'd rather I tell you what you want to hear? They were both in tears. Look, said Will, you believe some things and you feel some others, and they don't connect very well. But I don't believe you're responsible for Mike's death. I don't believe the driver is responsible. And I don't believe God is responsible. Mike died because his head hit a light pole. It's not meaningful, but it's true. I could tell you that God is a tyrant, but I don't believe that. I think that death just happens. Sherry fell silent. She and Will would continue the conversation for the next 3 years. Eventually, she'd be ready to start living again. She'd speak to Will's seminary students about what she'd been through. She'd remarry in 1991, and Will would perform the ceremony. But in this one moment, the darkness was too great to see through to any of that. Finally, she said, I'm sad. And Will said, I'm sad too. Will Spong was my father, and when I was growing up, I took real pride in his reputation around Austin. He didn't have his own church, but Episcopal congregations knew him as a must-see guest lecturer who played piano while he taught. The Gospel, according to Oscar Hammerstein, was a greatest hit. Some of those churchgoers also knew him as the interim director who came in when churches were in distress, when a priest died, or just as often when a warring congregation had driven a priest out. Dad had a way of telling the truth that didn't leave scar tissue, of getting people to agree to disagree. That accounted for his place in Austin's counseling community as well. When a therapist working with a couple identified a rift that was too great to mend, the two were often referred to Dad. He was considered the counselor that could help them make a clean, healthy break. At Austin Seminary of the Southwest, where for 30 years he taught pastoral theology, the nuts and bolts of how to apply faith to caring for people, he was known as the Will of God. It was an especially good joke given that his unwavering message in the classroom and at the pulpit was that no one can ever know God's will with any degree of certainty. To his mind, human understanding of God is necessarily limited, and it's too often used as leverage over others to demean, to exclude, or to otherwise diminish them. He used to say, we are all made in God's image, and all means all. It was a theology of humility and grace, and a less facetious distillation of it showed up on t-shirts which some students made one semester and wore around campus. In big block letters, they announced Dad's oft-repeated bottom line truth, God is God and I am not. At home, on the other hand, he was just Dad. And as far as I could tell, being a preacher was just his job. For one thing, he had a way of cursing when he discovered dog mess on the kitchen floor that demystified the word priestly for me. But also, I had numerous friends from more outwardly religious households, and even though their parents weren't friends from more religious households, even though their parents weren't clergy. The Spong said grace before meals, but not in restaurants. We attended services most Sundays, but we were Episcopalians. There was no expectation that we be at church for midweek expressions of our faith. The most conspicuous that Dad's work ever was at home was when he spent all day Saturday working up a sermon for Sunday, or on weeknights when he was on the phone with people having a hard time. What he was doing for those callers became clearer to me as I got older, especially after he died in 2004. The early letters that came in from grateful former students, clients, and colleagues were somewhat expected, yet they never quit coming. Even now, I get at least one email a year out of the blue and from a complete stranger, someone who wants me to know the impact that Dad is still having on their life. A Waco psychologist wrote that his counseling career was shaped largely by one conversation with Dad in 1973. A couple whose 18-year-old son was killed by a drunk driver in 1999 told me that the grief would have likely destroyed their marriage if they hadn't worked through it with Dad. They were powerful stories, but I don't think their gravity ever fully settled on me. I could understand them, but I couldn't feel them. And then one afternoon last fall, I was checking out at the grocery store and visiting with a clerk who'd rung me up probably a dozen times. Apropos of nothing, she said, "I didn't know your father, but I've heard he helped a lot of people. And I heard that if someone lost a child, he was the person to talk to." Sitting in the grocery cart was my 7-month-old son. He's my firstborn, the wondrous end product of a 3-year-long miracle of medical science that parents in their mid-40s, like me and my wife Julie, often have to rely on. And at this precise moment, he was fiddling with a tiny rag doll. And I watched him stick it in his mouth and look up at me like he wanted me to know that he had figured out where the rag dolls go. "Wow," I said to the clerk. "This is Will Spong's grandson, Willie. And that's a great thing for him to hear, and me too." It was not, of course, Willie's introduction to his granddad. I'd put Dad's portrait in the nursery well before Julie and I brought Willie home. It's on a nightstand between his crib and the old rocking chair Dad used to sing me to sleep in. All I really knew about my own paternal grandfather, who died when Dad was 9, was that he drank too much and, like my father, played piano by ear. Beyond that, he was a stranger. But I didn't worry about that happening with Willie. When I held him, snapshots of me and my dad's arm would pop into my head, pictures I hadn't seen in years. I had this strange feeling that I'd known Willie my whole life. He completed me. I remembered friends joking, after they had kids, about a terrifying moment when they realized that this little life was dependent on them for everything. And I didn't experience that. When Willie looked at me, I saw trust in his eyes, and it felt well placed and entirely familiar. The idea that something could happen to him is one that I can't have in my head. The depth of the love I feel has to be the only insight I ever get into the depth of that loss. And similarly, it's just as hard for me to imagine that anyone could say anything that would help a person through something like that. But then I think of Dad as I knew him. I remember long ago conversations, things that he said that made my head swim at the time, things that I can't wait to tell Willie about now. There was a night when I was 11, and Dad and I were on the couch watching the baseball playoffs on TV. The Yankees had just taken the American League pennant by beating the Royals for the 3rd straight year, but instead of showing the Yankees celebrating, the cameras lingered on the Royals shortstop, Freddie Patek. He was a small guy, not much bigger than I was, and he was sitting on the bench by himself. His feet barely reached the dugout floor, and he held his face in his hands, crying. "Dad," I asked, "why do they keep showing Patek?" "Because," Dad said, "the losers are always a whole lot more interesting than the winners." Dad only had one eye, but the glass one was such a close match to the good one that I never could tell them apart. He always said the way to recognize the false one was that it was the one with the glint of human kindness in it, a joke he attributed to my mom. The only way I could tell was to remember an evening when I was a kid and he failed to pick me up from Little League practice on his way home from work. Standing on the assigned street corner, I saw him coming from 2 blocks off. First I waved, and then I jumped up and down, and he drove right by. Turned out I was waiting in a massive blind spot. And so from then on, I remembered that the false eye was on the driver's side of his face. It was a disability, but he had fun with it. When my 2 younger brothers and I were little, and Dad went out of town, he'd leave a spare false eye on the breakfast table with a warning that if we misbehaved for Mom, he'd see us. When we were older and had friends over for dinner, we'd coax him to clink a beer bottle against the glass in his eye socket. At some point, a story drifted down from our parents about a seminary cocktail party at which Dad had quietly popped his false eye out and snuck it into the highball of the faculty's erudite professor of systematic theology. My gin and tonic would appear to be staring back at me, remarked the esteemed Dr. Green. There were other occasions, however, when the matter of Dad's eye was less light. When he groused about not getting half off at the optometrist, he didn't laugh. He quit playing catch in the yard with us once we got strong enough to put any velocity on our throws. And he wouldn't take us to baseball games unless he got seats behind the foul ball net. The few times that policy wasn't followed were tense. Eventually, we stopped going. He'd lost his eye at a baseball game in the summer of 1961. He was doing parish work at 2 churches in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, his first jobs out of seminary, and one night he went out to watch some of his youth group boys play American Legion ball. He was talking to some dads just beyond the first base dugout when a foul line drive smashed squarely into his left eye socket. His eye burst like a grape under a hammer blow. The recovery was slow and painful, and not just physically. His father's death had made him acutely aware of life's fragility and unfairness. His father hadn't believed in life insurance. His stay-at-home mother had quit school at the age of 14, and Dad, the youngest of 3, had been left to take care of her after his sister and brother moved out. But he tamped these lessons down to keep himself upright. A freak accident in a place as friendly as a ballpark will unlock all sorts of pent-up memories and emotions, and they'll be hard to rein in from a hospital bed in bandaged darkness. The encouraging words he kept hearing from well-meaning parishioners and colleagues didn't help. They'd throw in little bits of theology. God never gives us more than we can bear, they'd say, or you're lucky to be a person of such strong faith. One friend who checked in on him frequently was the bishop who'd sent him to Rocky Mount, Thomas Frazier. Frazier was a huge figure in Dad's life. When I was little, I considered him to be one of Dad's heroes. A formal black and white portrait of Frazier hung in every office Dad ever kept. And when Frazier died in 1989, Dad preached a sermon praising him as one of the few 60s-era leaders in the Episcopal Church in the South who'd stood up to segregationist congregations. But it was only years later, after Dad had died and I talked to one of his colleagues, that I understood Frazier's real significance to my dad. While recovering in the hospital, Dad confided to the bishop that the things people were saying were making him feel worse, not better. I don't feel lucky at all, Dad said. This actually feels like more than I can bear, and I don't know what to do with that. Frazier listened, and perhaps he realized that if theological crutches weren't helpful to Dad, then Dad might be a good person to talk to other people for whom they weren't enough. I've got a new job for you, said Frazier. There's a chaplain spot in the pediatric oncology unit at Duke Medical Center, and I want you to take it. Dad did, and there the story dovetails with one he did tell me. He started at Duke soon thereafter, before his false eye had been made and before the socket had fully healed. So he walked to the hospital with a black eye patch on, talking to sick kids and sitting with scared parents. He was still a mess inside. The eye patch and pain were constant reminders of a terrible thing. One day, a 6-year-old cancer patient looked up at him and asked, "Are you a real pirate?" Dad said everything got easier in that instance. His awful, irreparable loss was a connection to another person. I loved going to church with Dad as a kid, especially when he preached. My brothers and I would sit toward the front, and he'd always mention us. When he referenced lyrics from songs we'd heard in the house, we felt as if he was teaching things that we already knew. Of course, his sermon's ultimate lesson typically sailed over our heads, but the car ride home was where things like that got explained. Not that it always helped. I remember once, when I was maybe 10, asking him about the Trinity. I get that God is God, I said, and that Jesus is his son, but who's the Holy Spirit? I don't get it. To be honest, Dad said, I'm not sure I do either. But you're a priest, I said. I am, but that's a tough one. I wouldn't worry about it, though. I don't believe the Trinity is the point. This made no sense to me. I'd been to church with friends whose congregations spent half the service holding up three fingers. Keeping the Trinity front and center seemed to be the whole deal at those churches. Different churches and different people believe different things, Dad said. And I believe that there are other things in the Bible to concentrate on, like do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Everybody can get that one. I should point out that Mom was seldom in the car with us. She worked nights at the state hospital, and Saturday was the start of her work week, so she'd sleep in Sundays while Dad took us with him. They'd met in Virginia when he was a seminary student, and she was a pretty brunette nursing student. Sherry Polly was from a tiny town in Kansas where she'd grown up in a log cabin near oil fields that her dad worked. Her mother had died when she was 14, and Mom's response had been to steel her backbone. She abhorred debt, was constitutionally organized, and was always planning ahead. The food in her pantry was arranged alphabetically in rows she never let shrink below 3 cans deep. Dad always said that his mother never recovered from the death of her husband and that all she did was sit and cry. Well, Mom was the antithesis of that. She and Dad married a week before he was ordained in 1959, when he was 25 and she was 23. And after they divorced, just shy of 30 years later, he often said, "It's no mystery why I married a Midwestern stoic." They were both workaholics, and after moving to Rocky Mount in 1960, they learned they couldn't have kids and buried themselves in their careers. They were living in Durham when, in 1967, they adopted me at the age of 4 months. 2 years later, they adopted Patrick, and 2 years after that came the surprise pregnancy and the birth of a youngest son, Charles. In 1972, Dad took the seminary job and moved us to Austin. His hiring was not without controversy. The first choice to teach pastoral theology was usually a parish priest, someone versed in leading a congregation. Dad was a hospital chaplain who tended to people dealing with death. He had taken over Duke Medical's Clinical Pastoral Education Program, or CPE, in the mid-60s, supervising students who were learning to do the same. The seminary's concern was that CPE chaplains were typically more interested in counseling than teaching. They also had a tendency, after years in the murk of other people's loss, to lose their faith. But 2 years earlier, Dad had preached at the ordination of some new priests in Greensboro. He'd built his sermon around lyrics from the Fantastics. Quote, "Without a hurt, the heart is hollow." He warned the young men, and all priests were men then, that they were entering a world of crisis that the church didn't often have the courage to address. The ministry may be many things, he said, but it is not an attempt to make every man happy. Priests had to be willing to make unpopular stands. They couldn't die for fundraising targets or the demands of an arrogant vestryman, but they had to be ready to die for the gospel. That would require honesty with their congregations and with themselves. He preached, "Do not be afraid to hurt. Do not be afraid to have pain. For in so doing, you will hang in constantly as redemptive people in the process of life." The sermon was published in the Virginia Seminary Journal, and after it was distributed to the faculty in Austin, Dad got the job. The faith he discussed at school, at seminary, was the same one he described to me in the car. Back then, the Seminary of the Southwest was considered a progressive outpost of the Episcopal Church, and Dad fit right in. He didn't put stock in an active hand of God. Not that God is powerless to act, but that's just not what God does. The idea that God punishes or rewards or has a plan is an assumption that God works in the world the way that we do. God doesn't do, Dad would say, God is. And as such, God is present in all of human experience, be it suffering or joy, not as a protector from any of it, but as a partner in all of it. He didn't read the Bible literally, but it held profound meaning for him. He expressed skepticism when he talked about the specifics of Jesus' miracles, but he'd point out that they were always performed among the poor and marginalized. When I asked once about Lazarus, the man Jesus brings back from the dead in John's Gospel, Dad said the story's great lesson was not that resurrection, but Jesus' reaction when he came to Lazarus' grieving sisters. He wept with them. For so many people, Jesus is about saving us from sin, Dad told his students, which I think exempts us from what it means to be human. Traditional theology teaches that God sent his son to die, and he did die, just like everybody else does. But if there's a salvific piece of the narrative, it's that Jesus came to show us how to live. But Dad's job wasn't to make students believe what he did. He was teaching them to communicate their own faith. And to that end, he did insist that they ground their ministries in contemporary life. He led a seminar on the New York Times in which students had weekly discussions on everything from scriptural parallels for world events and how to chaplain the people involved in them to the ethics of the ads. He taught a class called Film as an Occasion for Prophecy and Perception, in which students wrote reviews for hypothetical church bulletins analyzing spiritual themes in movies like Do the Right Thing and A Clockwork Orange. The graphic violence of the latter film prompted strong protest from some students, but Dad told them to write about it anyhow. In his view, confronting harsh realities was a non-negotiable obligation of a life of faith. That was the point of his Greensboro sermon, and of his entire career, really. There's a video in the seminary library of a presentation he gave to incoming students in March 2001, 2 months before he retired. I could have roughly guessed the year from the opening shot of the video. His hair is to his shoulders, his beard is unruly and mostly white, and he's wearing his autumn year's uniform, a button-down shirt, a fleece vest, and khakis. Also, he's standing at a piano. Most of his latter career students and friends didn't realize he hadn't always played one during lectures. It was only after he fell in love with my stepmom, Nancy Whitworth, who he married in 1992, that he summoned the nerve to do that. She was in the audience with the new students in the afternoon of this lecture. He begins with a song that he calls an invitation to theological study, Alfie, from the 1966 film of the same name. Before he starts playing, he describes the movie's plot. Alfie is a cheerfully unrepentant womanizer running through a series of destructive relationships in swinging London. He moves in with a girl, Dad says. She becomes pregnant, and one day he comes home to her flat and finds the unflushed remains of an aborted child in her toilet. So he leaves, and Dad waves his hand as if he's whisking Alfie out the door. And then he sits at the piano. Dad does. And he says, and as Alfie walks down the street against the backdrop of the consequences of his own behavior, this song is introduced. And Dad starts to play slowly and to speak the lyrics. What's it all about, Alfie? The melody lolls under the words. And if life belongs only to the strong, Alfie? Until he arrives at the crux, at which point he stops playing and jabs at the air with two stretched out index fingers. As sure as I believe that there's a heaven above, Alfie, I know there's something more, something even non-believers can believe in. His hands go back to the keys as he starts to play again. I believe in love, Alfie. Dad ends abruptly, as if he's embarrassed that people might be admiring his playing. I think that song's fantastic, he says, because it looks on the face not of religion, for God's sake, not at syrupy, pious little God talk, but of the common denominator of human experience. It asks, who the hell are we and what's it all about? And if you're not asking those questions, if you're just here to learn how to put the vestments on right, go home. Don't come here for that. The world is too important. When Sherry Taylor visited with Dad's students, they weren't taking his newspaper or movie review seminars, but rather the CPE program that he had started at the seminary. When I met her for coffee one afternoon last summer, she told me a little of what she'd said to them. She didn't describe how Dad had healed her, because that's not what he did. At some point, she said, It just came to me that everybody dies someday, and I grabbed onto a little thread of hope that there'd be some happiness here. Life will never be like it was before Mike died. There's always a gray haze over the brightness. But there's a reason to be here, a purpose that justifies going through this. Dad continued to lead CPE even after he retired, and it's the course his old students talk about the most. For 10 weeks each summer, a small group of them would be assigned to an Austin area hospital. They'd convene at Dad's office for 3 hours in the mornings, then spend afternoons and evenings as chaplain interns in emergency rooms, intensive care units, and oncology wards, anywhere in the hospital they were needed. The work was emotionally grueling, and the morning conferences weren't much easier. The students had near daily writing assignments, things like hypothetical letters to a friend whose spouse had committed suicide. But more often, the papers were what Dad called verbatims. After meeting with patients, they'd write a short, anonymous medical history, the truest transcript of the conversation they could recall, and a description of their own feelings during the encounter. Each morning, they'd present those verbatims to the group for feedback. Students learned quickly that the real purpose of CPE was identifying the thing within themselves, a trait, a belief, or a piece of personal history that might stand in the way of being an effective pastor. One of the first preconceptions they often had to get past was the common notion of what a chaplain does. Dad had a number of blunt rules of thumb. A clergy person who walks into a hospital room and offers to pray is a clergy person who wants to leave, he often said. A death is not an evangelical opportunity, was another one. He had experience to back those kinds of ideas up. I once worked with a woman whose 13-year-old son had cancer. Her church sent her a letter that said, if you believe God can move a mountain, he can. If you believe God can heal your son, he can. A week later, her son died. And then she had to deal not just with the loss of her child, but with the feeling that some failure in her faith had caused it. Still, Dad also had patience. If a student mentioned God's plan in a verbatim, Dad would hear him out or her out, and then he would ask, how is bringing that up going to help? He was steering students away from the impulse to make things better. A crisis counselor's job is to listen, not to fix a person's grief or pull a lesson from it, but rather to hold it with them and to be there with them in their suffering. In therapist speak, that role is referred to as a non-anxious, non-judgmental presence. And it requires being comfortable amid pain. And most people can't do it. It's the reason most people just drop off casseroles. Finding that level of comfort was the hard part of CPE. When verbatims were honest and reflective, when students exposed the fear that they'd felt with patients or the memories that informed their conversations, the morning discussions would morph into something akin to group therapy. And they had to. A student who'd grown up with an alcoholic or abusive parent had to be aware of any vestiges of the victim's mindset. If one was wrestling with his sexuality, he had to address that before talking to a dying AIDS patient, which was a huge part of hospital work in the 80s. Students had to realize that a chaplain's conversation with a patient could never be about the chaplain. One student who went through that process towards the end of Dad's career was a woman named Evelyn Hornaday. Her husband had died in 1997, 2 months before she and her 25-year-old son moved to Austin from Missouri so that she could begin seminary. A year later, she took CPE. And I talked to Evelyn. And she said, I'd give your dad my verbatim and I'd start crying in the middle of it. I was still too wrapped up in grief for my husband. Once I'd catch my breath, your dad would say, go on. It was like we had this silent covenant. That was going to be my experience that summer. Evelyn graduated 2 years later, and a week before her ordination, her son, Jeremy, was badly hurt in a car accident. The injuries proved fatal. The first person I called from the hospital was your dad. He came and sat with me for 6 hours while Jeremy was dying, and he never said a word. He stood beside me when they took Jeremy off life support. He put his arm around me briefly, And then he went out to the waiting room. 2 months later, she was ready to leave for a church job back in Missouri when she ran into Dad on campus. He asked what she was planning to do with Jeremy's ashes. She was going to take them with her, she said. They were secure in a good box that she wouldn't trust to the moving company. They'd ride next to her in the car up to Springfield. And your dad said, "Oh, no, you're not." And I thought he was joking, because Will Spong never said, no, you're not. But Dad pushed her. He was no longer in counseling mode. He was a fellow priest, a friend of hers and of Jeremy's. He told her that she was already taking enough grief to Missouri. Austin was where Jeremy's home and friends were. He'd been an artist, and Austin was where he had created. It was where he lived. She half-jokingly asked what he thought she should do, and he said, "I've already talked to Nancy about that. She's got a boat on the lake, and the night before you leave, we will take Jeremy and a bottle of wine upriver, and you can release him." And then he got theological, Evelyn said. He talked about the water of life rolling on. He said, "Think of Jeremy and each drop of water, and think of all the shores and people he'll reach. Think about giving him back to creation." I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Think about it." The night before she left Austin, Evelyn drove Jeremy's ashes to Dad and Nancy's house, and then they all went to Lake Austin and motored upstream. It was a lovely evening, she said. At about 9 o'clock, the sun went behind the hills, and I said, "It's time." Nancy slowed the boat and turned it around. Your dad blessed the ashes. I kissed the urn, said my goodbye, and emptied it behind the boat. Your dad and I cried all the way back to the dock, each of us sitting in our little corner of the back seat. And then we drove back to their house in silence. I got in my car, waved goodbye, and that was the last time I saw Will Spong. Dad died February 3rd, 2004. When I found him in bed the next morning, I thought he was just sleeping. He was curled up on his side, the pillow between his knees, a quiet remove on his face, and the television tuned to CNN. I guessed he'd drifted off watching returns from the Democratic presidential primaries the night before, and I wondered if he'd stayed up late enough to see that his candidate, John Kerry, had all but swept. A fortuitous series of events had put me in the room at that moment. 8 months earlier, I'd moved onto the property where he lived with Nancy. It was a shady 1.5-acre spread 1 mile south of downtown that they bought shortly after they married. Their home was a converted 150-year-old gristmill, and the garden outside their bedroom window was on a dry creek bed below street level. When a hard rain hit, they could hear a small waterfall in the grotto from their bed. I rented the smallest of 4 outbuildings, which meant I ran into Dad in the driveway a good 4 times a week. When Nancy was out of town, he'd take me to dinner. She was on a trip in South Texas when I found it. I had spent the previous night riding at the office until 4 a.m. and then come home and slept in. So I happened to be there when his office assistant called and said he hadn't shown up for his first counseling appointment. She asked me to go check on him. When I walked in, I said, "Hey, Dad," and gave him a nudge. His skin felt clammy, which I recognized from giving him back rubs when I was a little kid. Every Saturday night, I'd rub his shoulders while he watched Carol Burnett. $1 for doing it, and $2 if he fell asleep. But this time he also felt cold. So I shook him, and his body didn't give. I checked his breathing, and he wasn't. I felt for a pulse, and I found none. And then I noticed that his face was ashen. I took a few steps backward, and I leaned against the wall. "So this is it," I said, and I slid to the floor. Time slowed to half speed as I sifted through my emotions. It seemed like everything he had ever taught me had prepared me for this moment. Death is a part of life. I decided to soak it in. I could hear birds in the garden, and I could smell juniper from a bowl of potpourri. I was grateful to be the one who had found him, that the end had been sudden and peaceful in a place that he loved. But also, those thoughts struck me as trite silver linings. Dad used to say that the way people lived was more important than the way they died. I looked at the framed pictures on his nightstand, a portrait of him and Nancy by her baby grand piano, A shot of the we three sons, on Patrick's wedding day. I thought about how the last decade of Dad's life had been by far the happiest, but I knew he was no way ready for it to end. None of us were. I looked back at him, cried for a little while, and then finally I said, "Thanks, Dad. I love you." And 10 minutes later, I stood up. And whatever poetry the morning had held took a quick turn. I called 911 on the bedside telephone, and I said, "My dad seems to have died in his sleep." And then I gave the dispatcher the address. And she said, "Have you tried to revive him?" And I said, "He's pretty dead." And her tone sharpened. "You need to perform CPR. If he's not on his back, put him there." So I struggled to roll him. His body had stiffened, so his arms and legs were now sticking up in the air. Before, he'd looked like he was sleeping peacefully, and now he looked like he was falling. "If his mouth is closed," she said, "you need to open it." I noticed that the tip of his tongue was sticking out, and I explained that. "You need to open the airway," she said. "Put down the phone, open his mouth, press down his tongue, and blow." My neck creaked through an exasperated 360-degree head roll. I got on one knee, put a hand on his chin, and just then heard sirens outside. I picked up the phone. "Your guys are here. I'll turn this over to them." The first EMS tech rolled through the door and said, "Yeah, it's too late for CPR." I excused myself and went back to my cottage and started making phone calls. The rest of the week went as Dad would have scripted. We had a service on Saturday at Good Shepherd Episcopal. Dad's brother Jack, a retired bishop and one of the most important progressive theologians in the Christian church, deferred officiating duties to Dad's closest faculty colleague, the Reverend Charlie Cook, so that the service would be a true seminary event. Instead, Jack sat with us, then addressed a rapt audience from Dad and Nancy's front porch at a reception that afternoon. An East Austin gospel group played after that. Several hundred people came, and it was strange to look at their faces and think that many of them had gone to Dad to learn how to deal with events just like this one. He had one last message for them. He'd written his own obituary. Though I snuck in one line, I wrote that he'd died probably from heart failure, knowing that he'd appreciate the acknowledgement that we weren't really sure what killed him. The rest of the obituary was all him. In 4 concise paragraphs, he identified his decedents and survivors, his degrees and jobs, and favorite sermon topics and songwriters. Then he closed by describing his beliefs about death. They were largely things I'd heard before: the Zorba quote, the t-shirt slogan, the plea for people to live with the ambiguity of life and to not be afraid to tell the truth. But there was one line I did not know. It was by the playwright Robert Anderson. And the quote is, "Death ends a life, but not a relationship, which struggles on in the survivor's mind towards some resolution it may never find." So 2 more memories. As a teenager, I did a remarkably thorough job of meeting people's expectations of a preacher's kid. Run-ins with teachers and school administrators were nearly constant, and there were also a few with the police. Beer drinking was typically a factor, but the incidents themselves, throwing snowballs at cars, throwing eggs at a buddy at the grocery store, stuff like that, got enough laughs in the telling that I never took any of it all that seriously. Dad, on the other hand, said that my drinking had prompted him to significantly cut back his own. And I always thought that sounded a little dramatic. One Thursday night, just before high school graduation, I went to a baseball playoff game in DeSoto, 3.5 hours away. The game went into extra innings, and I didn't get home until after 2 in the morning. This was before cell phones, and I hadn't checked in, but I also hadn't had anything to drink, and I half expected to get a medal. Dad was livid. I explained what had happened, patting my sober self on the back, which did nothing to settle him down. "Do you know what I did today?" he said. Went to work. Son, I spent all night in the hospital with a family whose son had been killed in a car accident. And then I came home and you weren't here. And you never called. So then I spent the last 2 hours wondering if you might be dead. Yeah, well, I'm not, Dad. I'm here. Why can't you just be glad about that? Such was the capacity of the preacher's kid to get inside the mind of a preacher. But one Sunday morning late last fall, Julie and I took Willie to church for the first time. She and I hadn't been regular churchgoers. Her family didn't go when she was growing up, and I'd slacked off mightily after Dad died. As we worked to start a family, however, finding a church was a priority for me that Julie understood. And so we chose All Saints Episcopal, a late 19th century limestone hall on the University of Texas campus, less than a mile from the seminary. As I carried Willie from the car, I felt my eyes well and tears start to roll. And when we turned onto the path to the church steps, I stopped. It occurred to me that one Sunday morning a long time ago, Dad had carried me into church for the first time too. I thought about how much that must have meant to him, but how long he'd waited to share his world with his son. I put my free hand on Willie's back and I pulled him a little closer. I pressed my forehead to his cheek and I closed my eyes, and then the three of us went up the steps and into the church. Alfie.